And welcome back for everyone watching online. I'm going to pick up this afternoon with the next chapter of Love the Stranger, which is all about equality and human dignity. And the photo here is from when Cardinal Nichols visited the Jesuit Refugee Service a few years back, meeting some of our refugee friends who have been made destitute and left in limbo by the UK's asylum system. And just want to quote something he said at the time. He said, "What I've heard this afternoon is how deep that darkness can be, and in a way, how deliberately that darkness is created, in a deeply mistaken sense that treating people this badly will prevent others from seeking sanctuary in this country." In Love the Stranger, our bishops reflect on Pope Francis's words in Fratelli Tutti, where he speaks about how, while no one will ever openly deny the humanity of migrants and refugees, we often treat them as less important and less human. And he says that for us as Christians, this is completely unacceptable because it sets political preferences above recognising the dignity of every person, which is such a central component of our faith. And that really is the main thrust of this chapter. Immigration and asylum systems, by their nature, divide people up and assign them different statuses with different rights. So whether you can work, whether you can access healthcare, whether you can be reunited with your family members, whether you can apply for support for housing, whether you can open a bank account, whether you could be detained or deported, it all depends on what category you're placed in, what visa you have, how your asylum claim is assessed. But Catholic social teaching says that this shouldn't be our starting point at all. Instead, our starting point should be each person's humanity, and that there are a whole set of rights that we're entitled to purely by virtue of being human. And the Church is also very clear on what this means in practice. So we've got the point that Pope Francis makes there about how everyone's entitled to personal safety and access to basic services. And a few years back, the Vatican published a document called 20 Pastoral Action Points, which set out the sort of things that we should be advocating for in terms of what migrants and refugees should have access to. So they say people should be able to access healthcare. They should be able to move freely. Children have the right to go to school. People have the right to legal advice and should have opportunities to learn the local language. And there's also a special emphasis on the rights of migrants and refugees to family life and family reunification. And Pope Francis has also been very clear about what is not acceptable. So he's highlighted the injustice of immigration detention and the immense harm that this causes to people. And this is an area that the Jesuit Refugee Service does a lot of work in, because the UK indefinitely detains thousands of people in prison-like conditions for the purpose of immigration control, and is set to increase this further. And the Church has also spoken out against the prison-like conditions that people are being held in at sites like Napier Barracks. During the pandemic, a group of Christian leaders, including the Cardinal, signed a letter about Napier, which said that after such a traumatic journey, having had to often spend times behind wire fences in refugee camps, it is simply insensitive to house people in such environments. And they said in a global pandemic, it's nothing short of irresponsible and risks the lives of residents and staff alike. They went on to say, even as a temporary measure, ex-military barracks are unfit for purpose and entirely inappropriate. Requiring members from different households to use and live in shared facilities greatly increase the risk of infection of coronavirus, and that residents cannot be held responsible for those sort of transmission rates when social distancing wasn't possible. And earlier this year, a report from JRS, based on accompanying people at Napier Barracks, said it concluded that life at the camp was so difficult, it was noisy and crowded, people were sleeping in large dormitories, there was an absence of privacy, and there was sleep deprivation, and these were structuring features of life at sites like Napier. They said at the same time the site felt like a prison to many participants, partly because of its physical setting, and partly because daily life there was so tightly regimented. They said many people were forced to relive trauma at Napier, closely bound up with the physical camp setting and its military and prison-like features, and that these things together were deeply damaging. But of course, since then, since this was written, we've only seen the further expansion of detention sites like this, including the Bibby Stockholm barge, which are so harmful to people's rights and to their dignity. And the point that the bishops really emphasise in Love the Stranger is that all of the rights they discuss here, all of the things that people should be entitled to by virtue of their humanity, all the things that people shouldn't be subjected to, these apply even in cases when people have arrived outside of the normal legal frameworks. And they quote the document Welcoming the Stranger Among Us, where the US bishops made the same point. And that's not actually that radical, because as they point out, under international law, like the Refugee Convention, it explicitly recognises that in order to reach safety, people may need to breach the usual rules of entering a country. And of course, immigration or asylum systems themselves are often overly restrictive or unjust in how they're set up, as we're increasingly seeing here in the UK. So even when it's legitimate for a government to enforce its rules, it is never legitimate to violate people's fundamental human dignity. And this is also very relevant to the practicalities of how our borders are policed. Catholic social teaching is very clear, categorically clear, that you cannot put someone in danger or fail to offer help solely in order to pursue immigration control. So in recent years, Pope Benedict, Pope Francis and bishops across Europe have given a really clear steer that search and rescue, that saving lives should be at the forefront of the government's response to the flow of people across the Mediterranean and across the Channel. And I just want to quote part of the Pope's address in Marseille last month that you might have seen covered in the news. He said, "Let us not get used to considering shipwrecks as news stories and deaths at sea as numbers. No, they are names and surnames. They are faces and stories. They are broken lives and shattered dreams." He said we cannot be resigned to seeing human beings treated as bargaining chips, imprisoned and tortured in atrocious ways. We can no longer watch the drama of shipwrecks caused by cruel trafficking and the fanaticism of indifference. People who are at risk of drowning when abandoned on the wave must be rescued. It is the duty of humanity, it is the duty of civilization. So the church teaching is challenging us not to reduce policy to the three words of stop the boats, but instead of save the people. And pulling this together, we have our next set of principles from the bishops. Defending the fundamental dignity of all migrants and refugees, regardless of their legal status, and Love the Stranger lists some of those very practical rights that we're called to advocate for. Calling for human life to be prioritised in all border security arrangements, and reject measures that place people in danger or deny reasonable assistance to those in need. And that applies to the razor wire on the US borders or the failure to save people in our own waters off the south coast. And an explicit condemnation of immigration detention and arbitrary expulsion. And this is one of the points where the new legislation currently being brought in that's likely to be based on mass detention and arbitrary expulsion because of how people arrived here is clearly completely incompatible with the Church's teaching. The bishops also call for international frameworks like the Refugee Convention to be upheld, and this is something that the Church has been so strong on at an international level. And again, that's something really significant given the attacks we're seeing on the Refugee Convention and on human rights frameworks in this country at the moment. And the importance of this kind of multilateralism, of states working together to protect human rights with strong international frameworks, is something that Pope Francis really emphasised. He gave a whole chapter to in Laudato Deum, the new document that he published last week. And Love the Stranger is also very strong on our own responsibilities as Catholics, not only for advocating to our governments and trying to change systems, but of making a practical contribution. So they highlight organisations like the Jesuit Refugee Service, Caritas, the SVP, as well as all those parish and diocesan initiatives like community sponsorship, where parishes are providing a welcome to refugee families. And for me, it's a real privilege working at JRS with so many committed volunteers and supporters who are making such a practical difference every single day. Now, the 6th chapter of Love the Stranger is explicitly about human trafficking and slavery, and a few of us were having discussions about this during the lunch. And this, of course, comes in a context where more than 50 million people are being held in slavery across the world today. 50 million women, men and children, including many right here in the UK. And of course, anyone can end up trapped in slavery, being enslaved, but we know that migrants and refugees are at particular risk. And this is an issue that Pope Francis has made a real priority for the Church, and the image here is of St. Josephine Bakhita, the patron saint of survivors of trafficking, who many of you will recognise. And her feast, as a result of the focus of the Church in this area, has been increasingly celebrated here in the UK in recent years. And the Church's work here is rooted in a very explicit condemnation of slavery set out in the Catechism, as you can see here. And this was reiterated by the Second Vatican Council, which set out the Church's opposition to slavery, to people being sold, and to what it calls disgraceful working conditions, where humans are treated as mere tools for profit, rather than as free people. Now, drawing on that, the Church is extremely active in the field, so there are Catholic charities and religious orders working here and across the world to prevent people being enslaved, to help people to freedom, and to walk with survivors. And a lot of this is drawn together in a document produced by the Vatican a few years ago called the Pastoral Orientations on Human Trafficking. And this is a really rich document examining the whole nature of trafficking and slavery, and crucially, how we as a Church can respond. Now, in Love the Stranger, the bishops highlight a particular message from those pastoral orientations, which is that it is often restrictive immigration policies and a lack of safe routes available to people that force them into the hands of traffickers in the first place. When someone is forced to flee their homes and they're prevented from entering a place of safety, they can be forced to turn to people smugglers, and that leaves them open to exploitation. And I just want to quote a letter from Bishop William Kenny. He wrote it on behalf of the Santa Marta Group, a Catholic anti-trafficking initiative, to Priti Patel when she was Home Secretary, at the beginning of these really restrictive immigration policies that we're seeing. He said, "The introduction of new barriers to entering and seeking asylum in the UK risks pushing more people into the hands of traffickers. Across the world, it has been consistently demonstrated that policies criminalising those seeking sanctuary and introducing new border security measures do not save lives, but are simply a charter for trafficking." He went on to say, tough criminal sanctions against traffickers must be combined with more safe and legal routes for those in need of protection. He said steps such as the creation of new UK border force powers to stop vessels, combined with the shortcomings such as the absence of any target for the UK resettlement scheme, will only compromise the intention to stop traffickers and protect survivors. And this is an approach that is promoted by the Vatican and reflected in Love the Stranger. We can't just talk about cracking down on trafficking gangs. We need to be upholding people's rights to flourish in their homeland. We need to be providing safe channels for people to migrate. And we also need to tackle the consumer demand that drives slavery and makes it so financially lucrative in the first place. And so we have another two principles from the bishops here. Firstly, calling for Catholics to play our part in initiatives to tackle trafficking and slavery. And secondly, affirming that wider context, that we need to view the fight against slavery through the prism of all those things that we've been talking about today, not least the availability of safe routes for people who are leaving their homelands. And now the final section of Love the Stranger is entitled The Gifts of Migration. And this, in many ways, is the most important part, because it effectively says that while we need to acknowledge the challenges and the suffering experienced by so many migrants and refugees, as well as our own responsibility to help, Catholic teaching challenges us not to reduce people's humanity to this alone. Rather, as Pope Francis explains, it is important to recognise that migrants and refugees are our sisters and brothers, our friends, and that he says the arrival of those who are different, coming from other ways of life and other cultures, can be a gift, for the stories of migrants are always stories of an encounter. Now, this is another aspect of Catholic social teaching that has really long roots. So again, we can go back to Pope Pius in the 1940s, 1950s, and he's not only calling for us to welcome migrants and refugees, but also saying that migration can have real benefits for both the countries that people are coming from and the countries that they're arriving to. These are economic benefits, social benefits, and cultural benefits. And he went on to say, the nations which give and those which receive will both contribute to the increased welfare of man and the progress of human culture. And this was reflected in a document that the Vatican published last year, which said that people on the move bring with them a great potential that is social, economic, cultural, human, and religious. The presence of migrants and refugees empowers every dimension of integral human development and offers our society an opportunity to become more intercultural and to grow in its humanity. Or, as Pope John Paul II put it, and I really like this quote, the integration of migrants and refugees makes our community more and more a reflection of the multifaceted gifts of God to human beings. Another aspect of this is the enormous contribution that Catholic migrants and refugees make to our parishes and the life of the Church, which is what Pope Francis is talking about here. And it was so fascinating talking with people at the lunch about how many different backgrounds people have come from, people's families have come from, and how many different communities, diaspora groups have made up church life in this country. Pope Francis speaks about how people coming from elsewhere to join our parish communities offer us an opportunity to more fully experience the Catholicism of the Church. And again, the Vatican has produced some really powerful guidelines recently, which call on all parts of the Church to take really practical steps to include people, to incorporate different traditions, and to build links with the Church in other parts of the world. The photo here is from the annual Migrants Mass, which some of us were discussing during the break as well. And this one was at Westminster Cathedral. And it's always a really wonderful celebration of how the church in the UK is shaped and enriched by the presence of people from all over the world. So here are the final principles from Love the Stranger. Firstly, recognising the presence of migrants and refugees enriches our culture and our countries. That this is something to be celebrated, not to be afraid of. The bishops also set out some of the practical steps that the church calls for, like opportunities for people to obtain regular immigration status and to become citizens, and to celebrate that really vital contribution of our own church community and to our church community. They also call for us to recognise the economic benefits and skills that people can bring, and linked to that, a call for people to have the right to work. There are currently so many refugees in this country who are denied that right, the right to work, and in turn we're denying our own country their skills and their contribution. And the bishops also call for employers to treat migrants and refugees with dignity and to uphold their labour rights, which is so important in a global context where migrant workers are often so badly exploited. So before our discussion, I just want to finish off with this photo of some young people from the Yazidi community who I met on one of my visits to Iraq. They'd been driven from their homes and were living in a refugee camp in the north of the country. And a few of us broke away from our group and spent a wonderful morning just playing football with them and chatting to their families. And they really reminded me, that picture reminds me of the underlying message in Love the Stranger, that while we're tackling some enormous challenges, especially in the political context of today, there is hope, and we can find that hope in our encounter with one another and our recognition of one another's humanity. And I really hope today has given you a helpful run-through of the document, and more importantly, that some of those principles may speak to you in what you're already doing and in what you may feel called to do. The link is there for the whole document, and I'd really encourage you to download it, to share it, to speak in your parishes and your groups about it. And I've also included the link there if you did feel you'd like to support the work of the Jesuit Refugee Service, and I've put out some more information as well. We've got some time for questions and discussions now, but I just want to say a massive thank you for giving up your time today, for coming here, and for those who've joined us online to celebrate this important document and to take forward the Church's mission to love the stranger. Thank you.